Hi, everyone. Zack Beauchamp is a senior correspondent at Vox. He covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right wing populism, and the world of ideas. He's also covered Israel extensively in recent years. And this July has a new book coming out called The Reactionary Spirit: How America's Most Insidious Tradition Swept the World, which examines the rise of anti democratic politics globally. It comes out in July, as I said, but you can pre order it now. A few weeks after the war began, he wrote a much talked about piece considering how Israel should respond to the attack on its country by Hamas. Now, as the war continues with no end in sight, we thought we'd have a conversation about the situation as it stands now and what might unfold in the future. Hi, Zack. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Katie, I'm really happy to be here, even if it's on a very grim subject.
Yeah, let's talk about the October 7th attack. I know in an article contemplating how Israel should respond, you wrote, two things are true. Israel must do something, and what it's doing now is indefensible. Can you explain those two seemingly conflicting ideas?
Yeah, so the first one is about the sort of in principle question of what do you do if you're a society who's been the victim of such a horrendous terrorist attack, and what are your obligations as a government to your citizens after that? And it seems fairly straightforward, right, to say that the first obligation of a government is to defend its citizens and preserve their security. And if October 7th showed anything, it's that Hamas posed an enormous, unthinkable threat to Israeli life, right? So many people. I mean, it was the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, right? And the Israeli government had not only a right, but an obligation to take steps to make sure that this never happened again. And given the nature of the threat that Hamas is functionally an opposing army and government just across the border from Israel, part of that response had to be military force, right? There was no way to prevent Hamas from launching an attack like this without taking some kind of military step. So I believe very much that Israel had the right to do something in response to what happened on October 7th. What I don't believe is that what it has done since then is defensible in all of its respects. There are parts of its response that I think can be defended, but there are a few things, right, including the indiscriminacy of its bombings, as revealed most harrowingly in a piece in the Israeli magazine, online magazine, Plus 972, and the cutoff of supplies and humanitarian aid to people in Gaza. I think those two elements of the strategy, combined with, I think, a third prong that's really important, which is a strategic end goal that seems very difficult to justify, which is the goal of quote unquote destroying Hamas, because it seems almost impossible to attain without an amount of bloodshed that's even beyond what we're already seeing. So this is sort of the dilemma for Israel, right? It has a right to use force to defend itself, but the way in which it's decided to do that has crossed, I think, any reasonable boundaries of moral proportionality and strategic sense.
There are those who claim that Israel has a right to respond with overwhelming force and that it's very difficult to have a more strategic approach given the fact that the Hamas terrorists embed among the civilian population. What is your response to that?
Look, it's a very important concern and one that's worth taking seriously, right? It is the case that Hamas has violated both the moral rules surrounding war and the law of war by putting its military emplacements in civilian areas. And there's no doubt that that creates certain insufferable difficulties for any Israeli offensive, and that that's part of the point for Hamas, right? They want civilians to die because it engenders them sympathy, right? They're really, truly awful people, and nothing I'm about to say is condoning their behavior. But, and there's a really important but, there are ways to fight against horrific terrorist groups such as Hamas that do things that make it very likely that civilians will die without the kind of mass civilian death that has happened over the course of this war. I mean, the proportion of civilians killed relative to Gaza's population is enormous. The number of buildings destroyed is astronomical. One piece in the Financial Times compared it to German cities during World War II that were, mass bombed by Allied forces. Another is that you can look at the nitty gritty of information that's come out about how Israel made its decisions. The investigation in Plus 972 magazine did a really, that a number of sources from inside the Israeli government. And what they said in part was that the killing of civilians was a strategic goal, not just an unavoidable necessity, but in part a strategic goal because inflicting suffering on civilians was a means of trying to push the population in Gaza against Hamas to incite an uprising. Now, that's one source, but they have other and very, very detailed information about the way in which targeting was done, including both the use of artificial intelligence and the threshold by which they were allowing a certain number of civilian casualties. That is, their rules in the military of, given the importance of an objective, how many civilians you're willing to let die in pursuit of that objective. Right. And that Israel has made such a high threshold that many civilians, even entire families, are wiped out in pursuit of what might seem like a relatively minimal military objective, rules that are looser than, say, the US military might use in a similar circumstance. So, there's this idea that Israel is boxed into waging war that kills civilians. That's true, but that doesn't mean the number and the proportion of civilians killed by the Israeli military can be justified. And the more information we get about what's happening, the more I think that their conduct is violating really just any defensible moral concept of how war needs to be limited.
What do you think the ramifications of these civilian deaths will be and have already begun to be?
I mean, partially, I think Israel is running out of military runway. Right. Israel is a small country. It's embedded in international markets. It's dependent on the United States for resupply and reammunition. And the more they kill in this mass way, and the more horrific rhetoric that you hear from certain members of the Israeli government, and there's been a lot of it, the less likely they are to have running room from the international community to continue doing this. It may be easy to forget now, but at the days immediately after October 7th, there's an outpouring of support and international sympathy for Israel, which is pretty rare in a country that's used to being condemned for its actions internationally. That's really changed, and you can track the change in the way the Biden administration has talked about it. They especially have grown increasingly critical and increasingly publicly critical of Israel's conduct and of the civilian casualties that have happened in this war. I mean, concretely, politically there, the more brutal Israel is, the more it'll drive up, at least temporarily, support for Hamas, right? This theory that you can bomb people into hating their own government or their own leaders, as opposed to just hating you, the people who are bombing them. It's never worked out. It's been tried before in a variety of different wars, and there's no evidence that you can do that. They just get really angry at Israel, the Gazan civilian population. And that's where the public opinion rebounds. And I think the third and most important thing is, I mean, the consequences for the people of Gaza themselves, right? Like a lot of these are innocent people who've done nothing wrong. They don't support Hamas. And even if they do, that doesn't justify killing them any more than voting for a US president waging war on some country just means that civilians can kill, that country's military can kill ordinary Americans. And those families, the pain and the stories that you hear from people who have survived about losing loved ones, about children dying. I mean, the greatest consequence and the most important one to me is in lives shattered.
What will happen to all these Gazans who are fleeing and trying to seek shelter if Gaza is pretty much obliterated by the IDF? Do you think the goal is to basically occupy Gaza and to remove the Palestinians from that territory?
So the honest truth is that the Israelis don't know what happens after this. They didn't know when they started the war, and they don't know now. I've heard this from high-level sources that there just isn't a plan. They believe they need to destroy Hamas because Hamas poses an intolerable threat to Israeli security. Now, what comes after Hamas in Gaza? Gigantic question mark. I do not believe that the intent of the offensive is to ethnically cleanse Gaza of Palestinians. The reason I believe that is because that's not the way that they have conducted the operation, right? And plus, there's not anywhere for them to go. the Palestinians. They can't go out of the Rafah crossing into Egypt because the Egyptians won't let them, and Israel won't let them cross any of the different crossings into Israel, right, and live there. So that means Israel, even if it wanted to mass displace the Palestinians, it would be very difficult to do so in any kind of practical way, nor is there evidence of them sort of designing a campaign around that. They've tried to internally displace people in Gaza. That's clearly true. No one with any power to turn their will into reality has proposed resettling Gaza. Right, there's some noise from minor members of the coalition, from lawmakers. There are sort of provocative stunts from IDF soldiers there, but there are no plans right now to reoccupy Gaza. They just don't know what they're going to do because there's no good option for Israel, right? And I think a major problem with the war plan is this, right? Is that they don't have a feasible idea of what they can do after they're done fighting to prevent Hamas from simply taking the territory back over. There are some plans that are out there, but Israel doesn't, they don't have a clue as to which one they're going to adopt.
How successful has the IDF been in, if not destroying Hamas, significantly eroding its capabilities? What are your sources telling you about that?
So what I'm seeing and hearing now is sort of a mixed picture. There was a very good piece in the Washington Post about this recently, right? But the basic point is that even if you take Israel's counts of the number of Hamas soldiers it's killed at face value, and it's in the thousands, and they could very well be right. It can be difficult, very, very difficult to make this kind of assessment in a war zone. Even if that's right, they've killed, let's say, I don't know, around 1/6 of Hamas's current fighting forces by high-end estimates.
That's it.
That's significant, right? But
One
yeah, right,
sixth.
1/6, yeah, it's significant militarily. 1/6, 1/5, something like that. It's significant. Again, like that would be a meaningful loss, right? 1/5 of the U.S. military being wiped out would, for American listeners, right, that's almost impossible to imagine in terms of what that would mean, in terms of the number of Americans that were killed, in terms of the consequences for its ability to fight. So there's no doubt that that's what they've done is a significant blow to Hamas, plus a number of senior commanders killed and captured, though as of yet, not any of the truly top level of Hamas leaders. But the group still exists. They still function, and they can still fight. If Israel were to withdraw tomorrow, Hamas would be able to reassert itself as the leadership force in Gaza. There's no serious question about that. So they have done significant work towards degrading and weakening Hamas as a fighting force, but no one could seriously say that they've destroyed Hamas, whatever that means, whatever definition one uses for it.
You've quoted Georgetown's Dan Byman, a counterterrorism expert, who told you ground fighting should last at most a matter of weeks. How do the dynamics of the situation change as the invasion drags on? Because so far it's been 6 weeks and counting.
I mean, right now, the noises that you hear from the Israeli government are, we are in this for as long as it takes to destroy Hamas. Right? They didn't adopt the proposal that Dan suggested to me, or that I broadly argued for in that piece that you referenced, Katie. That was not, it was not on the table in Israel at the time, because there's very strong public consensus there in favor of an offensive that would destroy Hamas. But as time goes on, that consensus is beginning to fray for a variety of reasons, right? And one of the big ones is that this has not brought a return of all the hostages. And so hostages, former hostages, and families of hostages and families of those killed in Israel have become the leading dissenting voice against the government policy, arguing that the priority should be getting the hostages out, and that vengeance or any military objective should take second seat to preserving Israeli lives. So that right now, the strategy is still very focused on this maximalist, we're going to topple the Hamas government and accomplish regime change, which, I mean, temporarily they have. Hamas is not functionally the government in Gaza, but it could return at any moment. We know from very hard-won experience in other post-war situations that toppling a regime doesn't mean that you can put a new stable one in its place that you want, or prevent the old one from coming back. Look at Afghanistan.
Do you see the chances for another ceasefire, like pause in the action, that would allow additional hostages to return to Israel?
So it's conceivable. I don't want to rule out anything. I have a hard time imagining there being a pause sometime soon. The reason being that the current pause, the one that had just happened and was extended recently, ended because for two reasons, right? One, Hamas seemed unwilling to let more prisoners go. And second, Hamas forces fired on Israel, right? That indicates that Hamas does not have an interest in continuing the truce. And basically, there are a lot of dynamics going into it, including the Israeli desire to bring back its own hostages. But what Hamas was getting, the thing that they wanted, was a pause in the fighting because they were getting pummeled. By any metric, they were suffering many, 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 many more losses than Israel was in the current round of fighting. And from their point of view, they get a bit of time to regroup. They seem to have judged that they didn't need that anymore, or that it wasn't worth the cost of giving up hostages. I don't know when their calculation will change. I really don't. That is a question that it will be very, very hard for anyone outside the group to answer because they don't communicate their strategic objectives lightly. So it just strikes me that Hamas believes they have more to gain from continuing fighting than continuing a prisoner exchange at this particular moment.
I'd love to talk to you about the consensus within Israel. You have said people outside of the country don't fully appreciate how much of a national consensus there is, at least among Israeli Jews, on the objective of removing Hamas from power. Do you think this consensus will hold? Because after all, prior to this attack, Israel was a very divided country in terms of the support it had for its the right-wing government of Bibi Netanyahu.
That's right. I think there's really important context here, which is the year of protest against the Israeli government that had been going on previously, right? The government had been pushing this very controversial plan that would basically bring the judiciary under the control of the political branches in Israel. And that had been widely seen among, I'd say, the Israeli center and left as an attack on Israeli democracy, and had led to the largest street protests in the country's history, which, by the way, the Israeli military had warned the government was creating a vulnerability, a sense of that Israel might be amenable to attack given its internal divisions among its enemies. These warnings, we now know, turned out to be prescient. But that meant the government was very unpopular before the war started. And now one thing that you're seeing increasingly and sort of across the Israeli political spectrum is a sense that the government bears significant responsibility for the events of October 7th. Right, that is also very, very widespread in Israel. The anger, the fury, really, at the prime minister and his chief allies, especially coming from the relatives of victims and former hostages. I mean, it's really, really, really palpable when you talk to Israelis about this.
And yet, support for the war is among Israeli Jews 93%.
Yeah, or at very least approval of IDF conduct, right? It's yes, they're separated in people's minds right now. There's a sense that Netanyahu brought us to this point and it's his fault. But now that we're here, we need to take this very, very aggressive response to make sure nothing like it happens again. And then we can deal with the political recriminations after we're safe. That's been the Israeli public's position, I think, sort of on average for quite some time. As the war goes on, I think you're beginning to see a little bit of fraying in that position. Not exactly anti-war sentiment, but a belief that Netanyahu is not pursuing the right objectives, and that he can't be trusted to lead this war anymore, and that he should resign before anything else happens. And I think as this conflict drags on without any kind of clear resolution, that sentiment will likely grow inside Israel and start to put some constraints on government action. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know when it will start to emerge. Right now, the sort of in principle anti-war left that represents the views that we understand to be associated with the left internationally is very, very small and isolated inside Israel. But the view that the government is not fit to run the war is much more widespread. So it's a question of those two sentiments linking up in Israeli public opinion, and becoming some kind of effective constraint on the government. That will likely happen at one point. I can't tell how long it would take.
How does this end, in your opinion? And can you walk us through some of the potential scenarios you're hearing from the various experts with whom you've been speaking?
Yeah, so I think that there's a huge range of options, and right now things feel more open than they have in the past. Right, then that, especially when I wrote that article, there's been some progress towards envisioning what a post-war scenario for Gaza might look like, but I just don't know if the political will is there to implement it. So I'll start with what it looked like the most likely scenario was for a long time, which was that Israel does an extraordinary amount of damage to Gaza, kills tens of thousands of civilians, and then functionally reoccupies Gaza, right? They just realize that there's no alternative, there's no way to provide security, they can't stand up some kind of proxy government, so they're just going to send their own troops back in, and Gaza will go back to the way it was before the Israeli disengagement in 2005, when it pulled its troops and settlements out of Gaza. That would have been a disaster, and it's still possible. It's still very much on the table. I don't want to rule it out. And it would be a disaster, strategic error, I think on par with or considerably worse than probably considerably worse than the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But there's other options. One of them is that Israel feels so much international pressure that it pulls back before the Hamas ability to reconstitute itself or form a government fully happens. And so Hamas kind of comes back into power, declares victory because they survived. This is not necessarily, like, it's not good. It's not the worst case option either. There's a good piece in The Atlantic by Hussein Ibish, who's a scholar who does very good work on this area, outlining why that actually is in Israel's interest as a potential solution. So that's worth considering. Another one
To reduce the military action and to what is it? Sorry,
yeah, sorry,
what exactly is in Israel's best interest?
to withdraw to sometime at some point soon declare that their objectives have been accomplished, that Hamas has been significantly weakened to the point where they don't pose a major threat of engaging in major terrorist attacks against Israel in the near future, and withdraw its forces without having fully accomplished the goal of destroying Hamas, whatever that means. So that's one option.
Shouldn't the United States and other countries be trying to find Palestinians who want to take leadership roles to replace this government run by really what is tantamount to a terrorist organization?
They should, and they are. So I know this from the U.S. government. I also have seen it in public statements from the Palestinian Authority, which recently a high-level PA official said, and this can be found in an interview in the Times of Israel, said that the PA would be willing to go back into Gaza and govern as its rulers under a series of conditions, right? One of them is that Israel rules out any kind of military involvement on its own as long as the Palestinian Authority is in charge. No Israeli troops ever in Gaza with a PA government. Second is that there be some kind of multinational Arab force that goes there for at least 6 months after the war ends and before the PA takes over to stabilize the situation. And then third is that Israel makes some kind of meaningful concessions or moves towards a two-state solution, in addition to all of its other commitments to the PA. What those steps are were not clearly outlined, but something to signal that Israel hasn't just given up on the peace process.
How likely are those things to happen?
Well, I think if the current Israeli government weren't so extreme, they would seriously consider it. They should. It's actually a very good deal from their point of view. Two major barriers, though. One, the Israeli government is extreme. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political survival, and let's remember, he's on trial, right? He's currently on trial for corruption. The trial just resumed. So his political survival, and maybe even his physical survival, staying out of jail, depends on staying in office and appeasing far-right parties that are members of his coalition. So it would be very hard to imagine Netanyahu giving up on his pledge, as he said, to not rule out Israeli future military involvement in Gaza under any circumstances. So that's a problem as long as he's in office. And second, I don't know if any Arab country would be willing to put their own troops on the line to patrol Gaza right after an Israeli invasion. That would be hugely risky for them, hugely risky. And it would probably have to be paired with some kind of major inducements from the international community and really meeting the United States.
Hasn't the Palestinian Authority, which is ostensibly in charge of the West Bank, shown to be incompetent and corrupt?
Yep, that is true. The Palestinian Authority is widely seen as incompetent and corrupt with very good reason. The fact that they're incompetent and corrupt in this horrible circumstance doesn't make them an unthinkable option. In fact, when it comes to governance in the Palestinian, when it comes to governance among Palestinians, it makes them the least bad option because Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, is still pretty clearly committed to some kind of two-state resolution with Israel. He's staked really his political career on the idea that it was possible at one point and may still be possible again in the future. The PA, despite having major problems, has the right set of ideological commitments and the kind of international legitimacy among foreign donors who are critical to propping up Palestinian governance to try to come to a more equitable solution. And the only feasible alternative among Palestinians is Hamas, right? Which is a vicious terrorist group that committed atrocities on par with anything ISIS has ever done.
And at the same time, you believe that if Israel doesn't take the right steps, that it's possible that Hamas will become even more popular among Palestinians in Gaza.
It's entirely possible. Yeah, it's entirely possible, right? If Israel continues to signal that there's no hope for a peaceful resolution, which they've done, especially under this current government in a variety of different ways, Palestinians will increasingly believe that the only way to fight back against what they see as Israeli colonization of their lands in an attempt to push them out of it, which is an explicitly stated objective of Israel's current finance minister, who's in charge of Israeli policy when it comes to the West Bank and settlement. Right, they feel like they need to resist with force. That, I want to be crystal clear, that doesn't make any form of resistance legitimate, that what Hamas did on October 7th is a mortal atrocity that is not to be justified or explained away, but it needs to be understood in terms of the wellspring of where it came from and what Israel needs to do if it wants to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And what it needs to do is not just try to crush Palestinians, because that drives them into Hamas's arm. What it needs to do is to give them hope. And to give Palestinians hope, it means showing that they can be treated humanely and that they have a path to national self-determination that doesn't involve destroying Israel, right? And that path has to run through the PA.
The Palestinian Authority. But how difficult is it to show Palestinians in Gaza there is a way forward following all these civilian casualties? I mean, that's kind of a difficult transition to make for the people of Gaza.
It is. I mean, it is, right? There's anyone who tells you that there is an easy solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that if you just sort of snap your fingers and take the right set of actions, that everything will be fine. Anyone who says that is lying to you, right? There are so many different interconnected problems. Like, I say things in this conversation, like Israel needs to take steps towards a two-state resolution. Well, it's done that before, and the negotiations surrounded that collapsed repeatedly over a variety of very thorny issues that are really hard to resolve. Things like the status of Jerusalem in the future, who's going to be in charge of the holy sites, what about the Palestinian claims of a right to return inside Israel for all the refugees that have been displaced. And that's even when you get to the point of there being enough trust on both sides that they can sit down together and talk about it, right? We're not even close to that.
And fears that the person who negotiates such an arrangement will be assassinated.
That's right. Yitzhak Rabin, who is the Israeli prime minister, who is most thoroughly, I believe, committed to peace and a two-state solution, and the one willing to take the most risk for it, was assassinated for those views.
Before we go, I wanted to take a look at this country and the divide that we're witnessing. Certainly a generational divide in many ways about attitudes towards Israel and the Palestinians. How do you assess this shift?
I mean, so here's the way that I think about it. It has to do primarily with what Israel was and what it is. You know, when I was growing up as an American Jew going to Hebrew school and stuff like that, we were all taught about Israel's history as sort of a story of a David against a series of Arab Goliaths, right? Israel was founded in 1948. The Israelis accepted a two-state solution, right? The UN partition resolution, where they would get a much smaller part of the land than they currently have. The Arabs rejected it and made war on the Israelis, fought multiple wars trying to exterminate Israel. Israel survived throughout all of that and thrived and became a modern state. And that story, right, of sort of a plucky Israel doing its best, picking up after the ashes of the Holocaust and becoming a prosperous home for the historically persecuted Jewish people, has
And
a lot.
a democratic state.
That's right. Yeah, it has a lot of resonance with Americans who lived through those events, right? Both Jews, especially Jews like me, but also non-Jews, right? It just, there's something about Israel that has long captured the imagination of a lot of Americans, and this sense of shared values, of Israel being a worthy moral cause, a democratic ally in a region of authoritarians. All of these really, really bound the two countries together and create a bipartisan pro-Israel consensus.
And in the shadow of the Holocaust, I should
Right.
add.
Right. Yeah. No, of course. Of course. And that's not the Israel that a lot of people in my generation and younger see, right? I'm 35, right? And most of us grew up and came of political age in the 2000s when Israel was in the midst of a bloody war with the Palestinians. And it was really just a decade of war between Israel and the Palestinians and in Lebanon. And then we saw, right, Israel become an increasingly far-right country, that was been governed by Benjamin Netanyahu almost unbroken since 2009 in a series of increasingly anti-peace governments, right? And we saw settlement expansions, we saw deepening occupation of Palestinian lands and cruelty directed towards Palestinians. We saw a very, very powerful, rich country building roads that were designated for members of one religious and nationality group, right? Like that, for members of one nationality that excluded Palestinians from going on them. I mean, we saw an Israel that wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a David anymore. This was a nuclear power, right? A nuclear armed power imposing a cruel system on largely helpless and vulnerable Palestinians. And that perception, that second vision of Israel, is the one that most matched what a lot of people in the United States and younger generations were seeing, right? They just weren't alive to experience the Israel that I was talking about a second ago. And the thing is, both of those stories are true in important ways. They're not conflicting. They're not contradictory at all, right? And if you go through Israel's history, and there are elements of both of them that are still true, right? And were true in the past. Israel, for example, after 1948, held Arab citizens under a kind of separate military rule until 1966, right? There's long been elements of illiberalism and racism built into the Israeli national identity. I'm not saying those things didn't exist, or there was a golden age where Israel was moral and now it's not. What I am saying is the liberal democratic elements of Israel have dimmed recently, and the authoritarian illiberal ones have grown in strength. And that has led to a profound generational divide between people who experienced different kinds of Israel, or different Israels, even one might say, where different elements of its identity were predominant in their own lifetimes and their own experiences of watching the news.
I'm curious to hear your reaction, Zach, to the university presidents who testified on Capitol Hill and could not seem to say that calling for genocide against Jews on college campuses was hate speech. That was how I interpreted it. What did you make of those testimonies?
Yeah, to me, those university presidents reflected a kind of class of academic leadership that cares more about avoiding lawsuits than it does about the substantive implications of what they're saying or grappling with real and difficult questions. I mean, one can dispute whether or not a student chanting "globalize the Intifada" is actually calling for genocide of Jews, right? That was sort of the issue in question on Capitol Hill. Many would say that they weren't. Many would say they are. I think it's a somewhat more nuanced picture than people on either sides want to admit. But I think that to me, it indicates a university system, right? More than anything about the specific contours of Israel-Palestine politics, a university system that doesn't really know how it wants to handle free speech issues and that hasn't come up with a coherent way or set of values for distinguishing between what is and isn't acceptable speech. And their inability to say anything compelling on Capitol Hill indicates a just sort of general unwillingness to take a strong position or draw clear and principled lines when it comes to issues like that.
Would you say it illustrates or represents a certain kind of academic cowardice?
I think that's accurate. I think there's a terrible climate on college campuses right now, especially elite college campuses, where I think a lot of Jewish students, for very good reason, are afraid of what it means and how they can express themselves publicly and Jewishly. And at the same time, despite it being, I think, much more normatively acceptable to make pro-Palestinian speech on college campus, like on the campus itself, there are a lot of external watchdog groups that will track any statement made by a professor or even a student that they think is unacceptably pro-Palestinian, try to get them blacklisted from future jobs. Right. The speech politics domestically surrounding this issue and young people is toxic. It's toxic. And these university administrators clearly, I mean, they're in a hard position. I sympathize with them to a certain extent. I mean, it's very, very difficult to navigate all these competing imperatives and multiple different just claims to being silenced and persecuted from different people. But they don't have a good answer. And I think that was fundamentally what was on display on college campuses.
Well, as you said, Zach, it's an incredibly complicated situation, both overseas with Israel and Gaza, and also here in the United States. And I would also guess all over the world, these conversations are going on. Thank you so much for discussing it with me. I really appreciate your insights.
Oh, well, thanks for having me on, Katie. It was a real pleasure to talk about this, even again, as I mentioned at the beginning, as grim as it can be.